I just think we're in a state where we're taking so many steps back from each other. And if you can find a way to take a step towards someone, I think that'll help us. I think that'll drive us towards a better world.
This is a podcast called Walk, Talk, Listen. An attempt to connect people and make this world a bit better by sharing opinions and experiences based on the belief that everyone's perspective is true, albeit partial. My name is Maurice Blom, and I would like to welcome you to yet another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen. Good day, everybody. This is another episode of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen. And as always, I'm delighted with today's guest who will introduce herself. Andrea, please go ahead.
Yeah, I as I was even thinking about what introducing myself would look like, I think I was struck by the fact that in the US, in American context, we often start, especially in these more like adult contexts, with like our professional background or that like point in our life where we felt the call or realized what it was that we were going to do with our lives. And I think for me, like my story begins like generations ago. I'm like very aware of the context in which I was born into. And like, we talk a lot about systems and structures and all of those sort of things, but even in my family context, like I really I come from a long line of people of faith. And of people whose faith was very integrated into their work and who saw their work as an expression of the love of God to their neighbor. Like you go way back, and on both sides, my mom and my dad's side of the family, we come from German Mennonites, and they were shopkeepers, and they were pacifists, and they were hotel managers and shoe sellers, and loved and served their neighbors in like these we have stories of that sort of came down. My grandparents on my mom's side were Christian missionaries in Thailand. But like what they did, you look back kind of at their legacy in Northeast Thailand, and it includes both the founding of a seminary, but also a leprosarium. And so there's just this, and my grandfather introduced some new watermelon into the region. And just these things where like, as I've learned, I'm like, oh, this is like, has been in my DNA. My parents were Christian development practitioners in Cambodia, and they worked with people living with AIDS, with orphans and vulnerable children, with kind of marginalized and oppressed communities. And so that's just kind of how I grew up and how I grew up understanding both my faith and work. And so when I went to college in Illinois, and then I moved out to DC, and I really wanted to, I think maybe I went through phases where I was like, well, I'm not going to do that. And then here I am back working. I've spent most of my adult life working in international development and even Christian international development and humanitarian work in a range of roles, from fundraising and board support to working in the CEO's office, to writing and communications work, program design, technical support, and now I really focus on external engagement and partnering for impact. And again, looking at that intersection of how does our work with local faith communities and how does even our faith itself drive more effective development outcomes, aligned with SDGs, and how do we work with a whole range of stakeholders, to bring about the most effective change that we want to see in the world. Yeah, so my current role is that I work at World Vision International as the lead director of faith and external engagement.
And thank you for that introduction. I absolutely like that. But for the listeners, you are at the moment in the US, right? So you're not in Germany, or you're not in Cambodia, or in Thailand. So when you were 4 or 5 years old and playing outside, you knew, I'm going to go this direction. It was not even a discussion about it. It was just, that is what we do. Is that how it happened, or?
Yeah, I think so. That is such a good question. I think the principles were ingrained
Mm,
in me, and I probably didn't even know it. I went to when I went to college, I did have this sense that like it was hard for me to be in the US. I was in the US for college, and it was a jarring experience, just from maybe from an economic standpoint, from a worldview standpoint. It was just different. I think a lot of people who grow up overseas, abroad from their home country or passport country, experience that. And I think my at that point my thought was, okay, like I just 4 years and then out of the country, and here I am, 25 years later, and still back here in the U.S. And I think I did have to sort of own that for myself, and I'm still figuring out what I want to do when I grow up, in some ways. I think it's been sort of an iterative process through um, opportunities and finding areas where I both feel passionately but also can learn new things and meet new people and kind of expand my perspective and my skill set and things like that. So probably when I was 4 or 5,
mhm.
I probably wanted to be a doctor. I think I was probably
Oh,
more,
okay. Yeah.
because like 3 or 4 jobs when you're that age.
Yeah. Yeah.
One is doctor.
And so what did you finally study? And
Yeah.
tell us also, because I think you have also worked outside of the US, have you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a little bit, yeah. So I studied political science, international relations in college,
Hmm.
and that was also this process of basically like looking through course catalogs, changing my major 7 times, kind of exploring different things, and finally finding like, oh, in this major, I want to take every class that I have to take.
Hmm.
Whereas, I was in sociology for a little bit, and the social, there was like a stats class that I was like, so it feels kind of a little happenstance in some ways, but the way the international development and political science major was structured, it was really like a third economics, a third political science, and like a third history, and then some
Mm.
language mixed in. And so I think that helped me choose without having to choose. There's still a lot of variety
Hmm.
and diversity in that. Um, so, and then my work I've basically been based in the States, actually. I was in
Okay.
DC for a while and then Seattle, and did program management work. So spent probably 30 to 40% of my time
Hmm.
internationally, but still based in the US.
Okay, got you. And where were you born and raised? In around
Yeah,
DC or not?
no, in my parents worked in Cambodia and also in Malaysia when I was a kid. So I was
Okay.
there, yeah, Southeast Asia, where the
So
best
at
food in the
what
world
at
is.
what age then did you go to the States? How
For
old were you?
college, for university.
Okay. So alone or with your parents?
Yeah, alone. My parents
Okay.
were still in Cambodia. Yeah.
Okay. And you have brothers and sisters?
I have one younger brother. Yeah. Yeah. And he's a
Okay.
few years younger. So he came back to the States after, I think, 3 years after I did.
Wow. Okay. So you were, how was that? Was that a big change? Suddenly, family far away?
Yeah, I think it was a big change. So it was a big change. And like I said, kind of jarring culturally. And
Hmm.
I went from like the tropics to winter. Like I was in the Chicago
Hmm.
area. So the first winter, it was like probably a little bit of like a dark night of the soul. Like, what have I done? But I think it was ultimately, it was a good experience. We had been back and forth enough to the
Hmm.
US that it wasn't like I'd spent years,
Yeah.
year and year there. So it wasn't a totally foreign experience. And I went to an American school. So from a cultural perspective, there was some synergies and some
Hmm.
some disconnect, I think. But I think it was really a growing experience in terms of figuring out my identity a little bit and
Hmm.
realizing that I wasn't this and I wasn't that. I was sort of this in between. And I think a lot of kids who grow up in a third culture, there's the third culture kid term,
Hmm.
often find like more commonality with other third culture kids, even if both the country that they've grown up in and their country, their passport country are totally different. There's just some sense of shared experience that we have, and I think that is, as I think about my work and relationships I have, I think that has been it's been a benefit and an opportunity, I think, is to really like lean in and think about asking good questions, not taking as much for granted about what normal is, or or what a baseline is for anything, really.
I would like to piggyback on that third culture kid, because my wife is a third culture kid, and my kids, in a sense as well. So I've read about it. How is it? Because you're saying now that you're staying in the States, and I see that often with kids that have moved from country to country, that when they are an adult, they don't want to move anymore. So that's one thing. How is that with you? And then the second question that I have is around friendships. Is that, are you making easy friends or difficult? And again, I'm asking it because I've seen some, third culture kids are hesitant because they are afraid that, they will lose their friend again. So.
Yeah, no, these are super interesting questions, and like I feel like you're my therapist right now. But I think in terms of the stability, you do often see third culture kids, or like army kids or whatever, people who've moved a lot during their childhood, really hunker down and root. Maybe they'll partner or marry with someone from a small town, and they like move there. And my experiences, I would say my work keeps me, my work and the fact that I travel a good bit for work keeps me from becoming like seriously restless. So I definitely have some of that urge to move, to go, to be in a new place, to experience new things. But I have been a little more rooted, and I think it is the work and the getting to experience different cultures, different, just the world in a very tangible way. And so I think these past these years during COVID, when we haven't been traveling, I mean, I think everyone has sort of, been thinking about, who am I? What do I want to be? How do I want to spend my days? What's the impact I want to have in the world, and what's important? And I think not having that outlet has made me a little more restless. So I recognize that in myself. And then I think on the friendship side, I think third culture kids, and this would certainly be true of me, are really good at making fast friends and like going like this deep so fast. But then there's this part, there's that like core part that is very hard for us to let people in. So people would see us as having a lot of friends, would think we're their really good friend, and would even maybe be quite open and honest and transparent with us, but we're not necessarily reciprocating. I think that's like well documented. I think can be really certainly true because of that movement and the history of goodbyes. And I actually went to a boarding school for high school in Malaysia, and I have really good friends still from there. And we joke about just how, like every year, it felt like the world was ending, we had this thing called the Wailing Wall, where we would sit around at like the night before graduation, and everyone would just like wail. It'd just be like, this outlet for our emotional grief of losing half of our friends who are moving or graduating. So, yeah.
No, and it is tough. I mean, on the one hand, of course, it's a blessing that you have so many people around the world as friends. But then, I'm getting older, so we have discussions about, in an ideal situation, would like to go to a senior home with your friends, because then you can share your stories, and it would be awful that when you're getting older and you cannot tell your story because people don't understand it. But if your friends are around the world, that makes it challenging, of course. So it's all a luxury problem. on the one hand, but it's different from
Yeah.
folks who have grown up around the world, definitely. Hey, I would like to make a jump, and that's to your work now in at World Vision in the role of external relations, right? It's what you do. So, what is the biggest challenge at the moment for you within that job?
I would say, so my particular work is really focused on kind of the role of faith in our work and how we build both faith partnerships, but also articulate the value of faith in humanitarian development work. And I would say the biggest challenge right now is that in the past 5 to 10 years, we have gone from a place where like all the faith-based organizations were like shouting into the night, faith matters, faith matters, faith matters, and now everybody thinks faith matters. Maybe not everybody. The majority of the world and the sector, whether they like it or not, think that faith is an important component and that engaging with faith actors is important. And as a result, there has been this proliferation of faith networks, of faith groups, of faith task force, of faith, all of these things. And it's a blessing, and it's really I think a reflection of really great work of people who have come before us in terms of articulating that story and how important it is and driving towards more effective and sustainable partnerships. But it's also a challenge in that there's not enough hours in the day to support all of these kind of siloed interventions, groups, task force in a meaningful way. And there many of them are trying to get their feet off the ground, and it's trying to determine strategically, like, where do we spend our time? How do we ensure that we're having consistency of messaging across these platforms, but also putting our time in the places where it's going to have the greatest impact for children and communities, and for the planet, and for all the things that we know are essential in our work together. So I would say that's our biggest challenge, or my biggest challenge.
I mean, I find it interesting that you're mentioning that kind of faith is back, because you know that this particular podcast is a spin-off of my 100-mile walk, and if I'm very often I'm accompanied by what I call co-walkers, and they walk with me for a mile or sometimes 10 miles, and very often we quickly start talking about religion and spirituality, and then the younger generation. And then some of my co-workers are saying, well, if they're my age, like, the young people are different. They don't go to church anymore. They might be spiritual, but they're not religious. Or others say, they are religious, but, church is, that's not connecting with them. Anyway, there are a lot of different opinions around it. And when I talk with younger people, it seems that the majority is disappointed in the church as such. That doesn't necessarily mean they don't consider themselves as religious or spiritual. So, yeah, my question to you is, what do you see happening among youth and faith, spirituality in your community? And especially, I make my question to you a little bit more difficult than I asked all the others before this, but how does that relate to what you just said to me in terms of, faith is back?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great question. And I can speak a little bit about my community, but I can also speak a little bit about like around the world, because I do often think what we're experiencing in Europe and North America isn't necessarily the same as what's happening in the rest of the world. And even here, I see a lot of variety. So just to position myself, our family moved last summer to Chattanooga, Tennessee. But we're a Bible Belt in the U.S. So, and so in terms of what that looks like or means, I think you definitely see a lot more youth in churches. And then the youth in the community that I know are very interested. They tend to be very interested in justice, and they often find their way from like action to sort of spirituality, which can sort of morph into religion, right? So depending kind of on where. And I think it really I just think it's in the US and in Europe, there's a totally different and more complex, maybe not more complex, just a different scenario than what we see and like what I see in our most of the contexts where World Vision works programmatically. And World Vision actually recently did this study with Barna, which is a Christian polling group that was a global study that looked at youth around the world. And in, I want to say like 20 countries, and their perspectives on Jesus, on the Bible, and on justice. And I think what you'll see is that and it's looking at teenagers, and they're incredibly globally. There's a lot of similarity in terms of the orientation towards justice and activism, and seeing that rooted in some sort of spirituality or faith. And then you start to get a bit more variety when you start to look at perspectives on the Bible, or honestly, there's pretty positive reflections of Jesus also, but to your point, a lot less, a lot of concerns about the church or the institution. And so I think it's just something for those of us who identify as Christians. I mean, I think it's something that we're all wrestling with, even as adults. Like, what is the church, and how do we ensure that it is living up to, Jesus, like what Jesus is calling us to in the world. Yeah, so I don't know if it's not necessarily a succinct or a clear answer, because I think it's so different in different contexts.
In the beginning of our conversation, you walked us, or you talked us through who you are going back several generations, and that faith is important. And it has always been in the family. You were just describing that the younger generation seems to be changing, although it depends on the context. Now, if your children are going through something similar, or will be going through something similar, it could happen that they will break, the tradition, quote unquote. How do you look at that? How do you feel?
Yeah, I think that's a really hard question, and something that I know a lot of my peers and friends are wrestling with, and I suppose we are as well. And I think part of my hope, and I think what the hope is for the church in particular, is that we really lean into that we really understand, like, Jesus's work in the world and God's work in the world, and that it is about stewarding the environment. It is about addressing injustice. It is about, walking humbly, doing justice. And I hope that, as whether it's in the family or in a local faith community, or increasingly, hopefully, in the global expression of the church, that our children can see that, and they can see reflections of who God is in the world in a way, through the church. But I also believe in the power of God and His work in their life. And so I think, I think it's a journey that we're all walking. Like, my kids are still quite little, and I find their insights about the world and about faith, like, so surprising. They're 3, 6, and 9, and just some of the things they say, I'm like, whoa, the insight and the way they make connections between things, and the way, a story they hear kind of gets their mind working is really incredible. So I guess I'm just kind of in a trust the process sort of way, sort of.
No, I understand. I hear you. I would like to mention two things. One is, and I often actually quote him kind of. I had a Dutch scientist, Kees Klomp is one of my guests, who talked about the need for revisiting our economics. And anyway, it's a very interesting conversation that I had with him. But one of the things that he mentioned about the youth is that the centennials are driven by purpose.
Mm-hmm.
So in contrast to millennials who are driven by meaning, and then they can find each other in the action. What was interesting is I do think also when I spoke with younger generation, they make that connection much faster between humanity and the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of maybe concerning that, and especially people working for faith-based organization where it should come as a kind of natural connection, that we often forget about this, and that's contributed also to the world that we have created, I think, for ourselves. At least one of the reasons. I'm oversimplifying, I know. Anyway, Andrea, I there are a lot of things that our organizations are working on. What worries you the most at the moment?
I think it might be, I mean, I know I should say climate here because I'm on your podcast, but that does worry me. But I think in a more, in a closer way, I think one of the things that worries me a lot is that we focus on what divides versus what unites. And I think as we see diversity of thought, at least, and maybe just diversity in general as a threat, rather than something to be celebrated, or a feature of humanity. That or an organization, an institution, a country, because I think it's in that it's finding those places of unity in diversity, where we can work together towards a shared goal, even if we're a little confused about a lot of other things and whether we agree or not, that I think the magic happens and the innovation happens and the new ideas come out. And I think so often right now we're afraid of that, and we draw really hard lines, and so we can't hear each other anymore. We're not listening, and so I think that leads to a lot of, I mean, that undergirds our inability to pass policies that would address some of the climate issues, for example, or be more open to refugees in our communities, or actually consider issues of gender inequality, or whatever kind of the thing is. Yeah.
Oh, and it's something that I would like to come back to later in the conversation as well, what you mentioned, because I think it has to do with something that the inner development goals try to address. Where do you still see hope?
Yeah, I mean, I think I see hope in so much of the work that I get to do, because it really is about bringing kind of unlikely partners together from across different faith traditions, like with multilateral bureaucratic types within the UN, with technical practitioners on gender, on sexual and reproductive health and rights, on, refugee and immigrant issues, into a shared space to talk about solutions, to talk about the problems, to frame the problems, and to actually take action to address those things. So I think there's so much hope, and there are spaces where this is happening, and it's just the louder spaces or the social media spaces. Those tend to sort of drown out these more face-to-face organic opportunities. So we just need more of that. Yeah.
Now, and where I think I see hope with you is, the work that both of us are doing around the UN on sustainable development goals, for example. And so that's something that I try to lift up as well during this podcast. If I ask you to, to talk to the listeners about the SDGs, what do you want them to know about the Sustainable Development Goals?
Yeah, a few years ago, I did my executive MBA at Seattle U, which I know you have connections there as well. And when, as you know, in the US, the Sustainable Development Goals, people are less conversant with the Sustainable Development Goals. They're just not as like in our cultural. I mean, they probably for you in New York and around the UN, of course they are, but in general, and in like business leaders and things, it's a few, here and there will have heard of them. And so when I would describe the SDGs to my executive MBA cohort, um, I position them, and I think this is true. I think this is what they are, as a promise that we collectively made to our children. And their promises about the planet, their promises about equality, their promises about education and opportunity, and like really about flourishing and about flourishing for generations to come. And I think we are in a position where we will break those promises if we don't, as a global community, as governments, as corporate leaders, as NGO leaders, as civil society, as parents, as faith leaders, really come together to double down and look really hard at these goals and where we're failing and why we're failing and what we need to do to get back on track. Even if the time frame is longer, like we really need to double down in order to make our promises, to keep our promises to our kids.
A growing group of people around the world is saying that, one of the reasons that we are not making the progress that we need to make has to do with that we did not pay proper attention to the abilities, skills, and knowledge that you need as an individual and as a community or as an organization. And so they did a survey and they talked among each other, and they came up with the inner development goals. What are your thoughts about the inner development goals?
Yeah, so I know I had heard about the inner development goals, and then I heard more about them on your podcast. So I looked, I've spent a little time thinking about them in the past couple of weeks, and I really do think they're fascinating, and I think it's a really, kind of the frame from like being out to acting, and getting through that collective component of it. I think that's incredibly it's a useful framework, as frameworks are. I think my question, just not knowing that much about how it works, and so we have the SDGs here and we have the inner development goals here, and yet I think where the majority of the work happens is, as you say, like at that organizational level. Even if a government makes laws, it's like, how does that trickle down into the bureaucracy and how they live and how they kind of make things happen. And so I'm curious if the inner development goals has a component that's looking kind of at organizational capacity building. We would talk about individual competencies and organizational capabilities maybe. And so all of these goals are also like very hard to cultivate unless you're in a community or an environment that's also taking the time and the space to cultivate that. So I would love to, I want to learn more about how organizations and institutions are thinking about this.
No, and there is now a danger that I'm going to sit on the chair of the guest. So, but I think that a lot of especially NGOs in the US and in Europe are thinking about the change, the role that needs to change from them, and that is due to so many things, right? I mean, basically the poly crisis is responsible for that. On the one hand, from localization to climate change, etc. I mean, we need to work differently. And one of the things that is coming out of discussions among these NGOs is that they need to work harder on working on thought leadership and stuff, and there that in a development goal framework seems to be a perfect fit. And that's the last thing I'm going to say about it, and that is, I'm a fan of Ken Wilber, who's responsible for the integral theory, and one of the things that he says, and he said many things, but one of the things that he says that any problem or issue has at least four perspectives. I, we, it, and it. So I think the Sustainable Development Goals are trying to change a system and process, the it and its perspective, but you can't really work on it without at least realizing that there is also an I and a we perspective related to that. So even if your focus is only on the system change, you can't do that without, we can't do our work without bringing ourselves. And I think, faith-based organizations have something to offer there. But what you also see is that the younger generation is demanding to, if they go work for an organization, that they can bring their whole self. That's I think the difference about what I have been seeing now after done this podcast now for I don't know 112 episodes, 113 episodes, talking with a wide scale of people, young and old, East and West, etc. So and the listeners, if you don't agree with me, let me know, and we will have a further conversation. I'm not saying that what I say is right. So absolutely not. It's one of the perspectives that's out there. So the Andrea also think that the framework maybe is a possibility to connect faith-based organizations with the more secular one. It provides again an extra framework. It's not the solution, absolutely not, but it's not the solution. There are many things that need to happen. That's what I think. Hey, what I do try to do with this podcast is to connect my audience with the guest, and my guest with each other. So I have a question from you from the previous guest.
How we can connect people who hold this power within themselves, or like people who bring peace to this world. How we can make sure that all these people are somehow connected and they are united in what they do to maximize the potential of having more peace in the world.
So that is, a softball question, how do we, it feels a little bit like a world peace problem. I mean, a world peace question. And I think one of the things that this makes me think of, kind of looping back a little bit to this conversation about how, particularly like in media and social media, there's this divisiveness. Like, I mean, we've probably all seen The Social Network, and we know about how algorithms like thrive on argument and division. And I think what this question makes me think of is just, how do we create a world where we are telling these stories of these peacemakers in much bigger platforms, where these kinds of stories these stories of harmony, these stories of peace, these stories of unity in diversity start to kind of crowd out the noise, the division, and start to create models and examples for all of us about how to more effectively move forward and find an unlikely friend and start to talk about some of these questions that we have, or even better, start to work together towards some sort of change we jointly want to see in our community, or in our world. And I think that just communicating more effectively about it can bring unity and hopefully learning and all those sorts of things as well.
Your question for the next guest.
Yeah, so my question is actually sort of related to this question. I want to know, like, what is, and it's more action oriented. I don't know if this doesn't actually work, let me know. But what I'd like to know is, what's one issue where you feel like fully decided, and you don't really listen to other perspectives, and what can you do to sort of open your mind, or open a conversation, or open a relationship, that would allow you to sort of reinterrogate a particular view?
How do you do that?
Well, I think I put myself accidentally in a lot of hard and difficult and awkward situations. I think some of it is in the work that I do, and I've seen it modeled really well in terms of um, bringing diverse stakeholders into a conversation towards a shared goal, and like, as you're doing that, these other things come out on the side, but you already have a sense of a bond and a meaningful relationship, and so you can have these kinds of conversations. I mean, these kinds of things happen even in my own organization, a Christian organization, about, what does it mean to be a Christian organization? So these conversations are everywhere if we allow them to happen. And I think too often we shy away instead of walking in with a listening and learning posture.
Hey, music is actually very important to me, so I always ask a question about music as well. It's considered the most difficult question that I'm asking by many. But if I ask you to come up with a piece of music or a song that best embodies what you are about, for a big part, which song or piece of music would that be, and why?
Yeah. So this is a really hard question. And it's a hard question for a lot of reasons, because like one song, and like everyone wants to be cool, so they want to make sure they're like they're not saying like a band that nobody's heard of, but then also you don't want to say like this is the obvious song that everybody, and and then you start to read the lyrics and you're like, oh, that verse doesn't align, it starts to get quite complicated. So for me, I have two, and they're more than like about what I'm about. They're more a reflection kind of my current inner world / aspiration. And the one that people have heard of is the U2 Beautiful Day. I think because it's all about the paradoxes and complexity, and the beauty in the world, and the fact that the world is falling apart, and the beauty in me, and the fact that I'm falling apart and failing in you. And so I think that was one. And then a second is there's this song based on Psalm 46 that was done by Bifrost Arts, and it goes through this passage, the psalm, which talks about, again, it's very similar, like the world is falling apart, and yet I feel this sense of peace because I know that God is at work in the world, and I know that he's going to be working. And the song ends in this like beautiful meditative, like, be still and know, and it just, that I am God. It's a posture that I don't naturally have. I am not a still person. And yet I think, maybe this also connects a little to the inner development goals, but this idea of like being still and listening and learning and trusting and knowing that like we can't do it all as individuals, even you and I can't, no matter how busy we get, but there is a sense of like grounding and stillness that's necessary. Like we act and in the world out of that rest, as opposed to like scrambling for that rest. So those are my two songs: "You Too Beautiful Day" and Psalm 46.
Is that the second Psalm 46? Is that how I can is the artist or the
I'll send you
person?
the link.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Awesome. And to remind the listeners, and for you if you don't know, but we made a Spotify playlist called #Walk Talk Listen, and there you can find all the songs that have been selected by my guests. Hey, I think still at the moment, Steve Hartman of CBS in the US is examining how one simple act of kindness, can create a rippling effect. I have two questions around this. One is, what do you think about that concept? And second, if I ask you to come up right now to do one simple act of kindness this week, what would you do?
Good question. Good questions. I do think it's true. And I think the science bears out. Like if I do something nice to you, you are like, I don't know, so many times more likely to go and do something nice to the next person you come in contact with, and vice versa. So I think it's great. I think this also speaks to, the whole idea of building unity versus division. Like, what is one thing that we can do to make people around us, whether they agree with us on X, Y, or Z or not, know that we care about them. In terms of the one action, I think what I can do even today is I have some colleagues who made like very clever and insightful remarks in the call I was in this morning. And I was thinking, I should let them know that really impacted me and others, I think, and haven't yet. Because you go on to the next meeting and you don't make the effort to do that. And so I'm going to go to there's two colleagues and just be very specific about some of the positive impact that they've had on my day and others' day and the work that we're doing together.
Great. I like that. Yeah, I'm absolutely sure they will really appreciate that. Hey, what makes you getting out of bed in the morning? Outside of the small kids that you and your husband have. So
yeah. I always envy people who have like a nice single focused answer to that question. In my experience, I see everything connected. So I start to say this one thing and then I say this other thing and another thing. But I think a few things that are really, if I can say a few things, that are really driving me right now. One is the situation of children on the move and refugees more broadly. I think it's an unprecedented situation. I know Church World Service does great work with refugees. I used to work with World Relief, which did refugee resettlement work here in the US. And I just find that issue and situation and like it's so complex and the legal things like that's something. The growing issue of hunger, which is very connected to the climate crisis and conflict and just the costs and the lack of affordability and accessibility of food for so many, and in particular the impact that has on children, that in certain realms of development like cannot be undone. Then I think about gender inequality and some, these issues are also are so connected. But I mean, I think the situation in Afghanistan as perhaps the most acute example on the world stage right now, but it is real and true for girls around the world not having the same access to education, experiencing violence and abuse and so many things. So I guess those three issues get me up and get me energized for the work that I do, and to build partnerships and collaboration, recognizing that these are huge, complex issues with deep roots in a lot of contexts, in a lot of systems, and so these are lifelong issues for so many people.
Any message, invitation, or question for the listeners?
I think maybe just kind of going back to the question that I had for the next guest is just like, as we think about the world and someone in the world who we find to be on the opposite, like even hone in on a person who you feel like is on the opposite end of all the things, whatever all the things are, or the most important issue for you, whatever that is. Like, are there ways that you can take a step toward them, even if it's not talking about the issues, but it's that random act of kindness, if it's your neighbor, pick up their newspaper for them or something. I just think we're in a state where we're taking so many steps back from each other, and if you can find a way to take a step towards someone, I think that'll help us. I think that'll drive us towards a better world.
No, thank you for listening. That really resonates with me. I mean, one of the things that I hope I'm able to contribute to with this particular podcast is that, to show that everyone's perspective is true, albeit partial. So, nobody can be wrong 100% of the time. So it gives you an opportunity to start a discussion, and conversation is part of a dialogue, and that can lead to many more things. So I totally relate with what you are requesting. A couple of quick replies to what I heard you say, and because I think it should be my task also to connect my guests in a better way. You talked about Malaysia, where you went to school. I interviewed Emil more than a year ago, I think, the daughter of the Prime Minister, Marina Mahathir, who at that time had just written a book about a father. And I think that's for everybody, but especially for you, because you know Malaysia well, might be interesting to you to listen to that. And then you were talking about gender-based violence. My previous guest was Mariam Turashan of an organization called Save You, and she developed an app, to help people, women, with those rising numbers around femicide, etc. So, and it's really doing well. It's now available, I think, in 3 or 4 countries. She's working on the US. Actually, it will be available. The app will also be available here. It's a very interesting young mother doing amazing work. So definitely those are the shout outs for me today. Any question that I should have asked you that I didn't?
I don't think so. This was quite an exciting and diverse list of questions. And yet, I think there's just so much connection between SDGs and the Inner Development Goals and what's worrying me in my life. And, it's been a fun and enjoyable conversation. And I hope sometime you invite a guest to be the host on your show, and they get to pose some of these questions to you, because I think it would be worth listening to.
I don't know if that would be as interesting, but no, thanks a lot, Andrea. I really enjoyed today, and so it was. I mean, we worked together on a couple of things, but it was really a lot of fun to listen to you, through this medium as well. So thanks a lot. Good luck with everything you do. And see you soon.
Thank you. Yep. Talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen. Please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram.